Hello, and welcome to Overheard, the Foreign Policy Research Institute monthly podcast that explores the national security implications of intelligence activities, irregular warfare, and political warfare. My name is Phil Wasielewski, and I am the director of FPRI Center for the Study of Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare. On our last podcast, we had a great discussion with Dr. Frank Hoffman on hybrid warfare and the uses and abuses of that term. If you've not already had a chance to listen to the podcast, I highly recommend that you do so. You can find it on YouTube or the FPRI website. Today, we're going to move from discussing hybrid warfare to discussing irregular warfare. Specifically, we're going to talk about two forms of irregular warfare, terrorism and insurgency, that are ongoing in Western Africa and being waged by two separate Islamic terrorist groups. One is a branch of the Qaeda, and the other is a branch of the Islamic State. Now, this may seem like a rather arcane subject to talk about today. Yes, 2 decades ago, counterterrorism and counterinsurgency were the primary topics in national security circles. But now, after having just celebrated the 24th anniversary of 9/11, these issues have moved far into the background as today's national security conversations seem to concentrate mainly on China, drones, and AI, whatever artificial intelligence may really be. Here at FPRI, we believe that irregular warfare is not only still important to discuss, but also very topical. As I speak in the autumn of 2025, American military personnel, diplomats, and intelligence officers remain engaged in the fight against Islamic terrorism in Iraq, Syria, the Horn of Africa, Yemen, and throughout the greater Middle East and Africa, to name the main theaters of this continuing fight. To discuss one of the deadliest of these theaters, the Sahel of Western Africa, we have as our guest today Mr. Mike DeAngelo. Mike is no stranger to FPRI, having published an analysis of counterterrorism operations in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger in March of 2025 on the FPRI website. And just recently, this September, FPRI published another article of his, a review of the counterinsurgency fight in Burkina Faso. And both articles you can find on the FPRI website. Mike DeAngelo is currently an Africa analyst at the American Enterprise Institute's Critical Threats Project, focusing primarily on the Horn of Africa and secondarily on West Africa. He has a master's in public and international affairs with concentrations in security and intelligence and African studies from the University of Pittsburgh. Mike has been a United States Department of Defense Boren Fellow based in Dakar, Senegal. There, he studied Wolof, the language of the Wolof people who live in Western Africa, especially in Senegal, Gambia, and Mauritania. He also served as a research assistant at the Timbuktu Institute, African Center for Peace Studies, while he was living in Dakar, and co-wrote a report about Salafi jihadi activity in the tri-border area of Mali, Mauritania, and Senegal. Mike is a true student and scholar of the region, speaking the language and having lived in there. So, Mike, welcome to Overheard.
Thank you for having me, Phil. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. I want to ask you to describe to our listeners the overall situation in the Sahel and explain to us how it is that the two main perpetrators of the violence, who are violent Salafist terrorist groups, are fighting as much as an insurgency as political terrorism. And what are the differences between the two, insurgency and terrorism?
Of course. So starting off with the region itself, so the Sahel is situated between the Sahara Desert and coastal West Africa. And for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to be focusing mostly on Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, as those are the epicenters of these Salafi jihadi insurgencies. Now, these countries are Muslim majority, they're ethnically diverse, they're based on agriculture and livestock herding. These two sectors play a vital role in their economy. And there are tensions between certain ethnic groups involved in these economic sectors that actually provide a source of recruitment for the Salafi jihadi groups that we'll discuss in a second. But Another thing that I want to stress about Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso is the governance shortcomings that they've historically experienced and that they're currently experiencing. So each of these countries has a history of military coups and unaccountable security forces, and also a lack of governance outside of population centers. So whatever experience that or relationship the civilians have with the government outside these population centers, they either don't have one, or in many cases it's a negative one because they've experienced ineffective or corrupt governance. So these ungoverned or poorly governed spaces have really laid the foundation for the insurgencies. Now, the two main Salafi jihadi groups operating in the Sahel, JNIM is the first one, which I'll refer to as JNIM. This is the Al-Qaeda aligned group in the Sahel. It's a unified coalition of several jihadist groups, and it consists of several thousand fighters spread across the Sahel and coastal West Africa. The other group is IS Sahel, or it's the Islamic State aligned group in the Sahel, and it's actually a splinter group from JNIM because ideologically it's a little bit more hardline. And IS Sahel has, estimated a couple of thousand fighters concentrated mostly in the tri-border area of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Regarding their goals, they share the same goal, but they are not necessarily working together to achieve that goal. A lot of times they often fight with one another. Their goal is to establish an Islamist state. What that actually consists of is definitely up for debate, whether it's a system of shadow governance where they exert control, but they're not the formal government, or whether the other extreme where they declare a caliphate. My assessment is that the realistic goal is probably somewhere in between those two extremes, but we can definitely talk about that later. The main point is that they exploit the ungoverned and poorly governed spaces that I described before, and to gradually build strength over time, which has led to the current situation that we're in. The Sahel is the global epicenter of terrorism. In 2024, estimated 50% of terrorist deaths globally happens in the Sahel, and each of the three countries are ranked in the top 5 on a global terrorism index. So you have active insurgencies going on in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The Salafi jihadi groups control wide swaths of territory, and they're also besieging population centers and increasingly encircling the capitals of Mali and Burkina Faso in particular. The insurgencies have also spread to some coastal West African countries as well, really making this a fully regional issue, not just a landlocked Sahel issue. The countries that have been particularly effective in coastal West Africa are Benin and Togo. And before I move on to the difference between terrorism and insurgency, just one example of the severity of the insurgencies is the blockade that JNIM has recently put on Western Mali. So JNIM is conducting a full-on blockade of Kayes region, which is the economic hub of Western Mali. It's an area where previously they had not been all that active. And what they're doing is they're exerting control over key roads and shutting down economic activity, in particular fuel shipments. They've actually been targeting fuel tankers and have burned many of them. And it's essentially cut off the fuel supply in Mali. And some people in Mali say that if the situation does not stabilize in a few weeks, that you could have essentially a severe fuel shortage, which is really an existential threat to the regime. But the regime has been unable to respond to it effectively thus far. So it just goes to show the existential threat that these insurgencies pose in Mali and Burkina Faso in particular, and also Niger to a lesser extent. Now, why we call them insurgencies rather than just simple terrorist movements? So it starts with the definition. So terrorism, we can define as violence targeting civilians to produce some sort of policy or social change, whereas insurgency is violence that primarily targets the government, a lot of times security forces, but also civilians who work within the government, so government actors writ large. And the goal of that violence is to control territory and to actually govern, essentially replacing the state. So JNIM and IS Sahel, they are primarily attacking security forces and exploiting those ungoverned and poorly governed spaces that I described before to control territory. They've actually set up court systems as well as taxation systems. So just, goes to show that their interest is to govern. And interestingly enough, they're actually perceived by some civilians as governing more effectively and fairly than their governments, which are, their governments are associated with, ineffectiveness and corruption many times. And, the JNIM and the IS Sahel have been able to exploit that and offer, a different vision, albeit a more hardline one. What I do want to know is that they do employ terrorism still, but it's a tactic. So they do this in areas that they do not control to delegitimize the government, basically showing civilians that your government can't protect you. And then they also do it to coerce civilians, to get civilians to accept some level of jihadist control. So you have terrorism as a tactic, but the core strategy is insurgency. And this is important because it does impact the policy response.
Thanks, Mike. That's a great overview of the situation. And, as you were speaking, and when you started off by saying that, poor governance and governance shortcomings have laid the foundations for these insurgencies. As I mentioned, this is 2025, we're taping this podcast, but it recalls to me the works of Bernard Fall from 60 years earlier in his classic book on irregular warfare, Street Without Joy. And he described, insurgency, the type of insurgencies at the time as revolutionary warfare, which was actually named by Mao Zedong in the 30s. And according to Fall, this was a violent fight about who and whose political philosophy can govern best. Or as others put it, it's the application of irregular warfare methods to propagate an ideology or political system. Well, when one considers that for these fighters, Islam and politics are one, this is particularly applicable. And while Clausewitz did not write much about this style of warfare, it is the pinnacle of Clausewitz's belief that military actions must be focused on achieving a political goal. So I see from your description what the political goal is. This is an insurgency waged by these two separate groups, parallel but not joint, to basically replace the current government, at least in the areas they're fighting, and use terrorism as a tactic to undermine it where they don't have control. Now, anytime you have an insurgency, or most times you have an insurgency, you're going to have a counterinsurgency. Mike, tell us, how have the different governments in the region reacted to these insurgencies, and what have been their counterinsurgency strategies? And also, are they working or are they counterproductive?
Yes. So I would describe the reaction of the governments to, it's basically been, as the insurgencies have escalated, their response has become more militarized. So actually in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, in the past 5 years, the militaries have overthrown the civilian-led governments and installed military juntas. And these juntas justified their coups, at least partially, by the security situation and really staking their legitimacy on not capitulating to JNIM and IS Sahel and pursuing total victory over them. Now, regarding their strategy, I would say that their counterinsurgency strategy actually resembles more of a counterterrorism strategy, and I identify this as an issue. So the focus has really been on temporary kinetic operations, so clearing operations, kill and capture, just pushing jihadists out of territories and subduing them when possible. But there's really less of a focus on holding territory and securing populations to then address the root causes of the insurgencies that I outlined before. So ineffective, corrupt, abusive governance, and also as well poverty and intercommunal tensions. Now, what these temporary kinetic operations have brought about is there's been an increase in indiscriminate targeting that has really affected civilians. And this has particularly happens after the departure of Western forces, particularly the U.S. And France. The military juntas, once they consolidated their power, they basically kicked out the Western forces. And since then, they've really employed a lot of indiscriminate targeting. And they've also begun relying on militias, mostly in Burkina Faso, but you've also seen this in Mali and Niger as well. And these militias are often associated with certain ethnic groups that are favored by the governments, which presents another challenge in and of itself. So in terms of how the operations have been going, I would say that it's safe to say the operations have been ineffective. JNIM and IS Sahel have continued to expand their territorial control. They're putting more pressure on population centers, and the security forces are actually increasingly contained to the population centers. They really have difficulty patrolling on the main roads outside population centers, and oftentimes are, if they try, they're ambushed by JNIM and IS Sahel, and in a lot of cases routed and defeated and forced to retreat. And an example of how contained they've become is in Gassi, Mali. So there have been reports recently that JNIM has lifted their siege of Gassi in exchange for the Malayan security forces not leaving their base, essentially, and not interfering with JNIM activity. So that just goes to show you, that, again, it's become increasingly difficult for the governments to operate. And also, too, the indiscriminate targeting and the militias, they've caused many civilian casualties. And this really does worsen the root causes of the insurgency. Rather than trusting the government, the population, in particular vulnerable ethnic groups, is really forced to seek security from the jihadist groups, which then helps, jihadist recruitment. And a good example of this is the Fulani ethnic group in Burkina Faso. So the insurgency in Burkina Faso started in the north, and this is a predominantly Fulani area. And the government responded by associating Fulani with the insurgency and really beginning a program of arbitrary targeting. And this has proven to, draw Fulanis into some of these jihadist groups. So the government, in a way, actually kind of caused the issue of some of these ethnic groups, joining the jihadist groups. And just one more case study that shows whether the current approach is working. Niger is a great example. So before the military coup in July of 2023 in Niger, they were really pursuing a multifaceted approach. They had traditional, kinetic counterterrorism options done in conjunction with French forces, with U.S. support as well. But they combined that with traditional counterinsurgency efforts. So things like demobilization and reintegration programs, intercommunal dialogue. And the violence had actually, right before the coup, the violence had actually reached its lowest levels in years. Now, you have the coup happen, and a lot of these programs, the reintegration and demobilization ones, they were cut. And also efforts, to facilitate intercommunal dialogue, those also fell by the wayside as well. And it was really replaced with increased repression and indiscriminate targeting. And the situation has gotten worse. So I think that gives kind of a clear before and after of whether the current strategies have worked.
Mike, speaking about counterinsurgency strategies and tactics, you mentioned some of them that are no longer being used in Niger. Your most recent article for FPRI discussed the local defense militias being used in Burkina Faso. Now, normally, local defense militias are a very useful counterinsurgency tactic. Matter of fact, we had an entire podcast not too long ago with Dr. Arturo Munoz on this subject and their misuse in Afghanistan, but how traditionally they are a very effective counterinsurgency tool. Your article says that in Burkina Faso, this was not the case. Could you explain a little bit to us why that is not working out as it has in some other insurgency campaigns or counterinsurgency operations?
Yes, of course. So Burkina Faso has really faced two issues with their use of militias. One ineffectiveness, and two, indiscriminate targeting. So on the ineffectiveness point, the Burkina Faso, they kind of subsumed the militias. They call them the VDP. They've subsumed the militias under state security forces. But what they haven't done is they haven't trained the militia properly, and they haven't armed the militia properly, even though it's written into the VDP law that they're supposed to do, both of these things. So what you've seen in Burkina Faso is these poorly trained, poorly armed militiamen getting routed by jihadist groups and being sent on missions that they're ill prepared for. Another key issue has been that the militias are not being properly overseen by the government of Burkina Faso. So a lot of times the militia groups will actually, because they're associated with certain ethnic groups, they'll, use the fact that they have, the ability to act kinetically, and they'll target their enemies rather than, necessarily fighting jihadist groups. And this has seen a real increase in abuses against the Fulani population in particular. So that's also been a major challenge. And it's the government. The shortcoming there has been the government was supposed to recruit equally from all ethnic groups, and they have basically excluded the Fulani from joining the VDP, especially in the hardest or most impacted regions in the north, which is completely counterintuitive. Because if they're not allowed to, join government forces and defend their own communities, and then they're being targeted by those same government forces, it's not absurd to think that then they'll be forced to join the jihadist groups for protection.
Mike, these operations against the Al-Qaeda and Islamic State affiliated insurgencies and terrorist groups are not being conducted in a vacuum. There have been foreign advise and assist missions, so to speak, in the region with U.S. and French advisors, because most of this is taking place in Francophone Africa, and then recently by Russian advisors, paramilitaries of Russian military intelligence. Can you tell us and explain to our listeners the difference in counterinsurgency advice that these countries in the Sahel region have received from their U.S. and French advisors, and then more recently from their Russian advisors? And what difference, if any, has outside assistance made in the fight against these two Salafist terrorist groups?
I think that the difference in advice can really be chalked up to the difference in intentions. So the U.S. and France got involved in the Sahel because we really shared the same security concerns as the government. At the time that we were most involved, I would say that counterterrorism, or I guess a better phrase would be preventing the spread of violent extremism, was really a tier one priority for both the U.S. government and the French government. So we shared the same security concerns. There were really no financial incentives for us to get involved. We were doing it for security reasons. And we conducted counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations, but also focused on capacity building. So training the Sahelian militaries on how to conduct, counterinsurgency effectively. Russia's taking a much different approach. So Russia is present in the Sahel, because they see it as an opportunity to replace the Western influence. And also, too, they've been able to extract financial concessions. The Russian presence has largely been a mercenary presence. So along with receiving direct payment in exchange for counterterrorism capabilities, they've also taken control or at least stakes in local industries such as gold, which is an important industry in both Mali and Burkina Faso. So, there's a difference in intention there. And how that's played out is Russia has conducted counterterrorism operations, but there is not a capacity building focus at all. And in terms of the difference that outside assistance has made, the U.S. and the French, we were able to provide enhanced intelligence collection capabilities, as well as force augmentation. And there was a UN presence in Mali as well. They helped secure roads. Of course, the situation, was still not stable, but we did help provide those capabilities. Russia originally, because they're mostly based in Mali, they originally helped the Malian government achieve some limited tactical victories. But overall, the situation has worsened. And in addition, the indiscriminate targeting aspect of it, one report from ACLID, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Organization, said that 4 out of 5 people killed during Wagner Group operations were civilians. So this is directly worsening the root causes of the insurgency and driving people to joining the Salafi jihadi group. So overall, I think it's safe to say that the Russian presence has not helped.
If anything, it's exacerbated the problem, and it's following the old, rule that they're not rule, but problem that such operations, indiscriminate operations, end up creating more guerrillas or insurgents than you kill because of obvious patterns of revenge. Let me ask you this. I found it very insightful. You mentioned that the difference in advice was because of the difference of intentions and what the Russian intentions have led to. Our intentions, the French intentions, were to prevent the spread of Islamic terrorism, or specifically violent Salafist terrorism. Could you explain to our audience what is the connection between these local Al-Qaeda and Islamic State branches that are waging these wars? What are also their similarities and differences, and their connection with the AQ or IS main headquarters? How much communication and direction is there between them? Are they taking the Al-Qaeda headquarters that's still in Afghanistan, providing orders and campaign plans to these people? The same with the Islamic State main headquarters, or are these branches pretty much autonomous and independent and more aligned philosophically as opposed to in a formal command structure? Could you expound on those questions?
Yeah, of course. So starting with the relationship between JNIM and IS Sahel. So again, JNIM is the Al-Qaeda linked group. IS Sahel is the Islamic State linked group. So they used to be collaborators. In fact, they were once part of the same groups. And they fought together in the Malayan Civil War. Now, so since they've separated, they've actually come into conflict with each other over territory. So they're enemies, and they have fought each other. And IS Sahel is really limited to that tri-border area of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Not necessarily because they want to be, but because JNIM has prevented them from spreading further. So regarding their similarities and differences, JNIM really takes a localized approach to its insurgency. So it's gradually implements Islamic law. Granted, its dictates are still severe, but it's a more gradual implementation. It takes time to build connections within the community, helping to mediate intercommunal tensions, and also co-opting local leaders so that they support JNIM's efforts. IS Sahel, on the other hand, has taken more of a maximalist approach, a kind of a classic Islamic State approach, so targeting anyone who doesn't conform to their maximalist dictates, and really carries out public demonstrations of that force. Not saying that JNIM doesn't as well, but the Islamic State Sahel seems to rely on it more. In terms of their relationships to their headquarters, so it does not seem that they are taking direct orders from Al-Qaeda headquarters or the Islamic State headquarters. They are relatively autonomous branches, that come up with their own campaign plans and implement their own strategy. And really, they benefit from the global brands that Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State provide. So JNIM actually sends money back to Al-Qaeda because of its success. Jainim is the number 2 Al-Qaeda branch in the world behind Al-Shabaab in Somalia in terms of the amount of revenue it brings in. It's actually able to support the central organization. So I would argue that Al-Qaeda headquarters benefits more from its association with Jainim than Jainim benefits from its association with Al-Qaeda headquarters at this point. Regarding IS Sahel, they receive foreign fighters from other Islamic State groups, presumably to help train them and also to give them experience fighting. But again, I think it's important to note that, the Al-Qaeda and Islamic State headquarters are not directing, the day-to-day operations of Jainim or IS Sahel, and not even necessarily dictating the strategy either. These are largely local movements that do have global implications, though. And the Islamic State, as well as Al-Qaeda, have been, more than happy to, take the successes that these affiliates have had in the Sahel and present them as their own globally.
Okay. Mike, at the conclusion of most of these podcasts, I'll ask our guests kind of the same question. And regarding our topic today, I want to ask you why Americans should care about this. Both those, who follow irregular warfare, professional military, intelligence, diplomats, scholars, and also average citizens. Why should the average American care about 2 Islamic insurgencies in the Sahel? How does this affect them indirectly or directly, and what could it mean in the future?
I think the first consideration when considering why Americans should care about Salafi jihadi groups is the threat to the homelands. So at the end of the day, these groups are violently opposed to U.S. interests and values and have shown that and stated that as well. The capability to attack the homelands, on behalf of, so Jainim's capability to attack the homeland, IS Sahel's ability to attack the homeland, it could potentially be there if they decide to devote the resources that they have at their disposal to doing it. I would argue that with Jainim, the intent is not there right now. They really seem to be focused on what they're doing in, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, as well as coastal West Africa. But with IS Sahel, that transnational intent is there. There have been IS Sahel attack cells foiled in Morocco and Spain. The UN has reported on the existence of transit networks from the Sahel, or IS transit networks from the Sahel into Europe. And IS Sahel was also linked to an attack plot on the U.S. embassy in Angola during former President Biden's visit there. I believe it was in December of 2024. So basically, the territorial control that they have in the Sahel, it really gives them the space and the resources to export extremism if they choose to do so, especially when you consider the foreign fighters that transit through the Sahel and gain experience. So they could always devote more resources to the homeland effort. You can't discount that. And it has happened with other Salafi jihadi groups in the past. I would say at the very least, they can make West Africa, or try to make West Africa, a no travel and no business zone for U.S. companies and threaten U.S. assets as well. There was an attempt by the Islamic State West Africa province in Nigeria to conduct an attack on the U.S. embassy in Nigeria. So, the U.S. assets in the region are also at risk.
Mike, you mentioned foreign fighters. Now, I'm assuming that these are fighters who are not indigenous to Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, or not those ethnic groups or tribal groups. Where are these people coming from, and where do they go once they get their combat experience there fighting in these insurgencies?
Yes, so I have not really seen any reports. I'm sure some reports are out there about where exactly these fighters are from outside of Africa, and then where they go back to. I'm not necessarily confident enough to say for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if there were fighters from the Middle East, of course, but you also have populations from other African countries that are not associated with the insurgencies, traveling to the Sahel to gain that experience as well. And then, of course,
this can be a Pan-African problem right now.
Yes, and then you add in the fact that there are proven transit zones from the Sahel to Europe, whether that be migration routes or just simple, established Islamic State routes. I think that increases the risk for sure.
But this war or these wars provide still steady training, combat experience, and then a cadre of motivated Salafist Islamic terrorists for the future, for whatever cause they may want to move to next. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes.
Okay. And what are some of the other reasons why Americans should be concerned about these ongoing insurgencies, the threats they pose to us, to our national security, either directly or indirectly?
I don't think it's ever good for U.S. interests. I think every citizen should care if a whole region becomes unstable as a result of Salafi jihadi insurgencies, and that's exactly what's happening in West Africa. JNIM in particular has shown an interest in expanding its activities in coastal West Africa. In coastal West Africa, so countries like Nigeria, Ghana, traditional U.S. allies, and also the economic and population hubs of the region. So if JNIM is able to, if it chooses to, and is able to successfully expand its operations there, that would completely destabilize the region and any U.S. interests there. Another thing are the indirect effects of that. So what we've seen in the past is conflict breeds migration, correct? So you would probably have increased migration flows, at least to Europe, and potentially the U.S. as well. And immigration is a tier 1 policy issue in the U.S., so this could be an impact as well. And also, JNIM and IS Sahel have co-opted criminal groups. So they extort criminal groups, and they work with criminal groups as well. The relationship between them is very fluid, and some people are both criminals and involved with the jihadist groups as well. So you could see an increase in things like arms smuggling, drug smuggling, human trafficking as well, which is also related to the migration issue.
Mike, thank you very much. That's a very well-informed review of the situation in Sahel, the 2 Islamic terrorist groups operating there, the threats they pose, and the situation as it stands now. For those of you who are listening who may be interested in learning more about this, again, I recommend that you go to the fpri.org website and look up Mike's 2 articles this year that discuss the Islamic insurgencies in Africa Sahel region. And also for those of you who are listening, thank you again for tuning in to Overheard to get different perspectives on intelligence activities, irregular warfare, and political warfare. We hope you'll continue to listen and to recommend us to your friends. If you enjoy these podcasts, please visit the Foreign Policy Research Institute website at fpri.org to subscribe to our mailing list and to receive updates on future podcasts and other FPRI events. Please also consider joining FPRI and donating to it to support our efforts to provide the public and policymakers with fact-driven, nonpartisan analysis about the most pressing foreign policy and national security issues facing the United States. We look forward to you joining us again next month for a new Overheard podcast. Goodbye.